So welcome to this live stream presentation by U3A Helderberg. And my name is Jeff Burton, and today I'm taking care of the technical side of the presentation. Now, have you ever wanted to gain a unique understanding of your strategic environment and be better placed to make sound long-term decisions while protecting yourself against the risk of being blindsided by unanticipated developments? If so, you're in the right place today, because today we have a strategic intelligence briefing from the Center for Risk Analysis, South Africa's leading political, social, and economic risk advisory group. Our presenter today is Chris Hattingh, who is a senior policy analyst at the Center. Now, Chris has a special interest in trade and economic policy and is a member of the Advisory Council of the Initiative for African Trade and Prosperity, as well as a senior fellow at African Liberty. He holds an MPhil degree from Stellenbosch University. And the title of Chris's presentation today is Towards South Africa's Tipping Point. The presentation today will be around 45 minutes, and then Chris has around 15 minutes afterwards to respond to any questions that you might raise. Now, because we are live streaming to YouTube, we can't see you and you can't talk to us. So if you have a question at any time during the presentation, you can type it into the live chat panel on the screen alongside the video on YouTube. Now, you will need if you're using Google, you will need a YouTube channel to enable that function. So if you don't currently have a YouTube channel, but you'd like to type into the box a question, when you start to type in the question, you'll be prompted to set up a channel. All that means is that you have to type in a name. It doesn't even have to be your own name, but a name, first name is fine. And then hit create channel, and that's all that's required. And then you tap on the back button or click the back button to return to the video, and then you can type in your question. So, and also if you want to review a recording of the presentation, or if you want to share the presentation with someone, you use exactly the same link that you've used now to log into this live stream event. Okay, so without any further ado, I'm going to introduce you to Chris and then bring up his slides, and away we'll go. So Chris, over to you. I'm just bringing up your
Thanks, Jeff. Are we good to go? Jeff, just confirm if you can hear me. Testing.
Sorry, I got disconnected there, but yes, you're ready to go.
Oh, you're good. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Just let me know anytime if my connection drops or anything like that. Thanks. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much to Jeff for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to present our tipping point briefing to those of you in attendance today. We hope to provide a bit of overview in terms of economics, politics, and the policy landscape in South Africa for the past year and going forward into 2024 with general elections coming up. In this briefing, I would like you to keep in mind the metaphor and the image of the buffalo dominating the South African savannah. And in this scenario, for us, the buffalo represents the ANC which has dominated politics in South Africa up until this point in time. And we're going to ask, is that going to continue going forward? And if not, in what form might it still happen, or might it not? So we're going to try and answer some of these questions. Just to give you a bit of an overview of the presentation, here we have the main sections as we go into first the state of the nation. We're going to look at some economics, public finances, South Africa's growth fundamentals, what is important for voters, voter priorities, and then finally in terms of a political shift, and we'll try and give you some scenarios where we think the country might go into 2024. So we're going to start off with the state of the nation. We think it's useful to look at the context from which one comes, what has happened in the last few years, and indeed the last 20 years, what has precipitated the current state of affairs, and what might that tell us about the way going forward. So the image we chose is from the violence and looting last year in July in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng. We think This was precipitated by the untenably high unemployment situation in the country. This is not to give complete justification to something such as looting and violence, but if you have very high unemployment, you have the right ingredients in place for that sort of thing to happen. And we think that's a continued big risk in the South African context, a repeat of July 2021. So last year in September, we did polling as the CRA. We went to a range of voters in our survey, and we asked them the basic question of whether their life was better, the same, or worse than it had been 5 years ago, to try and get a bit of a timeline context for how they were experiencing things in South Africa. It's one thing to talk policy and philosophy, as we like to do, but it's also very important, arguably the most important, to try and find out how people are experiencing things on the ground in a concrete way. In terms of those results from the polling, you can see by far the majority of South Africans feel that their quality of life had worsened versus 5 years ago. About 19% feel it is better, and then we have the same at 23%. So the vast majority feeling frustrated with the status quo, feeling that things aren't improving, and indeed that things have worsened for them in terms of their quality of life. We think that this feeds into this particular graph that I'm showing you now with the proportion of protests that were violent. So we track it from 1997 till 2020, and you can see after 94 into 1995, 96 and 97, the steady decline of protests, of proportion of protests that were violent as economic growth increased and people got jobs. Unemployment was lessened, economic activity took off, and people felt that they could engage in society and try and improve their lives and that of their families. But from 2008 onwards, we see the steady increase on average, where the people feel that maybe taking to the streets in a violent manner is the best way to try and deal with their grievances. Looking at the state of the economy, and here in the background we have an image of Medupi Power Station. The South African government up until this point has taken the developmental state model, so thinking and feeling that the state should be at the center of economic activity, of society, of job creation. So, for example, we have these huge power stations being built, but when that fails, you have very big risk points, pressure points for the economy, and that in turn has the cascading effect in terms of little to no economic growth. So just looking at real GDP growth for South Africa and comparing us to the world average and emerging markets, we go from 94.
Chris, sorry to interrupt you. We're still stuck on the is your life better, the same, or worse than 5 years ago slide. It didn't move forward to the previous. Oh, there we go. There we go. That's working. That's it. Yeah, great.
Okay, so we've gone through the protests. That fine?
That's fine. Yeah, working now.
Okay. All right. So just comparing South Africa with the world average and emerging markets to look at our real GDP growth. And again, you can see the tale of two eras as we try to tell it. So from 94 till 2008, 2009, South Africa doing better. You can see by the red bars increasing its real GDP growth. But since then going down. Of course, we had the global financial crisis, but as we like to point out, global events are always going to impact on South Africa, and it's up to us in terms of how we set things up in the right way or not, if we make the right policy choices to ensure that we have economic growth regardless of what happens. And then just comparing us to especially emerging markets, you can see the orange lines by far outstripping South Africa, and again here doing better than South Africa. And then even after COVID and the lockdowns, the serious impingement on economic activity that occurred there, emerging markets have bounced back relatively better than South Africa has. Now we're looking at GDP per head for South Africa and the world average. So just comparing us to the world here, you can see
Chris,
again.
Again, Chris, the slide didn't move.
Sorry about that. And now?
No.
Nothing. Anything now?
No, still the same.
Oh, my connection is still fine. Problem with these big images that we use in this presentation.
Do you want to close it and reopen the program?
Okay, let's try one more time. And now?
No.
Sorry about that. Okay. Let's go here. Are you seeing a change on the screen?
No.
Okay, I'm going to close that and open it again. Right, any changes?
No.
Okay, now?
No, nothing. I'm just going to remove it from our screen here and add it. So can you let me just see if I add this back. No, it's the same slide. Just try moving forward again. There we go. Oh no,
Maybe I
it's
should
still
leave
the
it in
same.
this view. Let's see.
Yeah, they're just a little bit small.
How's that?
Yeah, well, it has changed. So let's see how we go with that.
Okay. All right. So we were comparing South Africa's GDP per head with the world average. And you can see again how we did relatively well from 94 up until around 2008, 2007. Economic activity took off, more investment happened. The government did implement reforms that meant more investment could come into the country, more businesses could be formed and be created. And with that, you had more job opportunities. But if you look at us with the world average, that was by far outstripping South Africa. So we are steadily falling behind. And I just want to point out to you here if you look at the right-hand side, from my right-hand side and your right-hand side, 2022, and if you go back all the way until about 2007-ish, 2009, we're back at the level where we were then. So we've effectively wasted all this time in terms of implementing the wrong policies and putting us on a back foot. And again, not affording many South Africans those opportunities to get a job and to invest and maybe save in their families and in their communities. Right, looking at the next
Chris,
slide.
we've had some comments that the broadcast screen is blank, but I don't know why that would be. I'm just going to again just remove the slides. Would you?
No problem. I can stop share.
Yeah,
And
let's
we can
try the
try
sharing
again.
again.
Share screen. Click on this one. Okay, and how about now? Can you see that one, Jeff?
It says they can see you. I'm just waiting for, so will somebody else tell me whether you can see the slides now on the screen? Anyone? Johan? Judy? Roger? Yeah, okay, now it's fine, Chris, apparently. It's fine.
Okay. Thanks very much. Yeah, so we're currently going to look at unemployment, the unemployment situation in South Africa, to try and make sense of how that is shaping up and how that might impact on policy and politics going forward. So looking at South Africa's unemployment rate, Jeff, is it moving now?
Yes, it is,
Okay.
Chris, yeah.
All right, okay, cool. All right. So South Africa's unemployment rate, unfortunately, telling the wrong story. So from 2008, we were around 29%, and then when we had the first stanza of the Jacob Zuma administration, since that point, we've got the steady increase of the unemployment rate. Unfortunately, up to 45% in terms of the first quarter of this year, and this is on the expanded definition. So that includes people who have stopped looking for work. When you've got lower economic activity, then you've got fewer job opportunities being created and people out of the job market. I think one of the saving graces for South Africa is the informal market and how people have managed to engage in economic activity in that sphere, try to make a living for themselves and their families. But this isn't the right picture that we need to be setting. And in terms of the global context, we've got lower economic activity across the board. So the US, China, the Eurozone, under a lot of pressure, and that's going to mean lower demand for South African exports, lower demand for commodities, farming outputs, that sort of thing. So that again means more pressure on South African businesses. And will they be able to create those job opportunities that they could before? I think the risk is quite high that the unemployment rate will continue to increase going forward. Looking at the duration of unemployment in South Africa, so we go from 2008 to 2022. In this context, we wanted to look at the issue of no country is perfect. No country creates perfect employment and perfect job opportunities and the sort of utopia, but some countries do relatively better than others. And in terms of unemployment, you want, if someone loses their job, as happens with economic activity, with boom and bust cycles, if someone loses their job, you want their bounce back ability to be higher. So their ability to re-enter the job market, as it were, for them to have the right skills, the necessary level of education to make sure that they can bounce back on their feet, or at least not be out of the job market for too long a period. And in South Africa, if you look at our long-term unemployment, the red line, that has been somewhat consistent, but as recently as 2020 has been going upwards. And then in terms of our short-term unemployment, less than 1 year, that is going down. So we need to reverse this trend of these two lines. That would be ideal if we could reverse what seems to be a strong trend now going forward. Looking at South Africa's employment opportunity cost, again from 2008 to 2021. So here we're looking at if we had continued on those growth rates that we had from 94 up until 2007, if we'd continued making the right policy choices, not chasing away investment, not pursuing policies such as expropriation without compensation, allowing private sector competition in electricity and at the ports, all this sort of stuff, maybe then we would have been on a better trend. So we just wanted to put this in this sort of stark contrast. And if you look at the number of employed people in South Africa in the black bars, so around 14.5 million in 2008, and at the moment 14.5 again, all this time that arguably has been wasted. And if we'd continued growing at those emerging market growth rates, you can see by the red bars, we would have around 24 million people in employment. So much more people would then be independent, have a sense of agency and dignity over their lives, and not be reliant on social welfare, and be able to contribute meaningfully to economic activity. So looking at social grants and the number of people employed, social grants and social welfare in the South African context have played a very important role, given the country's history, given the policies that were perpetrated before 1994. But in our view, social grants as the only reliant for people is not a tenable situation. It does not lend to a real life of dignity and agency. And I think South Africa at this point in time risks becoming too reliant on grants. The government feels perhaps this is its only way to help citizens to speed up economic activity, but the grants are so measly that they don't go nearly far enough in terms of doing that. So this capable state model that we had, it's not, the South African state doesn't have the capacity or the finances to fund that sort of thing. And I think we're going to see that now in terms of this particular graph. So you've got the number of employed people staying again relatively stable but declining and having dips here and there. And then if you compare that with the number of social grants being paid out, the orange bars, you can see the very steady increase. And then from about 2016, 17, really taking off, where in 2021 and 2022 with COVID again, you had the social relief of distress grant. So a new grant being introduced, and now there are calls for a basic income grant. I don't think any of these are going to be removed anytime soon. It becomes very politically difficult and untenable to remove grants, especially in a country of such high unemployment. So if we think in terms of the future, if you think perhaps the ANC will fall out of power, future governments coming into power are going to have to deal with this particular situation where how are they going to consolidate grants? Are they going to be able to remove them or not? How are they going to deal with that issue? Now, just looking at public finances, Jeff, just to double check if the slide is moving.
Yes, I'll let you know, Chris, if he doesn't.
All right, thanks. So with public finances, we've got here Minister Enoch Godongwana. This was earlier this year when he delivered his main budget speech in February. And then, of course, recently he delivered his medium-term budget speech where he talked a bit about how the South African state's finances are doing a bit better than they did in the past, looking a bit stronger. That's thanks to the commodities boom of the last 2 years. Again, pointing out those global bellwethers of China and the Eurozone. If they encounter recession and lower economic activity, as I think they will do next year and the following year, that means less demand for South African commodities and in turn less tax revenue. So the South African fiscus is going to come under even more pressure in the next 2 to 3 years. Looking at national government finance as a proportion of GDP, so it's one thing having a capable state, but that state needs to be funded. All that government activity, all the bureaucracy, all those departments need to be funded somehow, and that is taken in terms of tax revenue, tax collection, and a proportion of GDP. So here we've got the gray line, we've got revenue, somewhat consistent from 94 until recently, not doing too badly, again, being boosted a bit by the commodities boom of the last few years. Then looking at expenditure, you can see, especially around 2000, between 2000 and 2007, the Mbeki era, how well government did in terms of being fiscally responsible and in terms of getting real private sector growth and activity going. But since that time, you've got the expenditure line heading ever upwards where we are at this point in time. And then finally, you look at the deficit of surplus line, the red line. So we were even at one point running a surplus, just around 1% in 2006, 2007, quite an incredible achievement. But since that time, coming down and down. And the other issue, of course, governments all around the world borrow. This isn't to say that the South African case is unique. But if you've got higher risks in your currency, if your currency is being devalued, the more debt that you take on, you need to repay, as well as the interest on that debt. And that's going to put more pressure on the South African government now with repaying and dealing with this budget deficit that we have at the moment. We also wanted to put the budget deficit idea in terms of a longer time period. So we went back to 1913 until recently in terms of the data that we could try and find. And if you see how it shakes out, we've got two particular periods that we'd like to highlight for you in terms of interest. So if you look at here on the right-hand side, just the big deficit again that the budget is in at the moment. If you go back to around 1939 till 1945, 46, up until 49, that was another period. And then if you go even further back, around 1913 to 1916, 17, again, where we had a comparably big deficit. So, of course, those two time periods, the two world wars, and in both those instances, after such a big deficit, you had changes in government in South Africa with both instances of the Smuts governments being voted out of power. So at that point in time, those governments not being able to spend as much as they did before and being voted out. And now we've got the same situation with the South African or the ANC government. And we wonder whether the historical precedent maybe portends what's going to happen for the ANC as well. looking at gross government debt as a proportion of GDP from 93 until 2024. Just again, putting this in the broader context, you can see how well government did to lessen its debt from 94 up until 2007. It's actually quite remarkable when you think about it. But then we had a reversal. You had promises around freer higher education. You had other big spending promises, and the only way to implement that is by taking more of GDP, taking more of the productive part of the economy, and that in turn puts pressure on the private sector. So, for example, you increase taxes, you collect tax revenue in different ways. It might not be a wealth tax or something obvious, but you try and do it in other subtle ways to finance that debt that you're taking on as the state, and then you depress the private sector's economic activity, which in turn means fewer job opportunities and business growth happening. Now we just wanted to look at government expenditure items as a proportion of the total expenditure. So again, it's all well and good having this idea of a capable state, spending on various different things, trying to get economic activity going, trying to help citizens who can't help themselves, spending on things like healthcare and education. So we just wanted to look at where is the spending going at the moment. And we broke down into these bands. So you can see the different ones, such as economic affairs, education, etc., etc. But I'd especially like to draw your attention to the top band, the debt servicing costs. And if you can see how that was shrunk a little bit up until 2009, 2010, but since that point in time, how it has steadily increased again up until where we are, 2023 here, projected 16% in terms of debt servicing costs. And that wedge is then pressing down on everything else. So we are likely to see cuts in other forms of government spending. Will this come in things like higher education, maybe healthcare? Where is the pressure going to come? And then how is the government going to deal with that? And of course, that's going to impact on indigent and poorer South Africans who maybe are very reliant on different forms of government spending. So how is it going to shake out when that spending doesn't happen maybe as it used to before? Just a bit of a global snapshot for you. Looking at selected commodity prices, the global picture. So you've got things like Brent crude, gas, and coal, all doing pretty well the last year, especially. And then for South Africa, that means more demand for our products. So that's why we collected more tax revenue. But even on that point, we could have done much better. We've got lots of inefficiencies at our railways and our ports. That means we didn't get as much commodities out as we did beforehand. And just again, you've got the price of wheat and gold as well as iron ore declining a bit. So at this point in time, maybe gold still a good hedge for the future, but in terms of relative value, not as high as it was in previous years. Next up, we just look at South Africa's growth fundamentals, the sort of macro policy economic points where we might be getting some things right, other things wrong, but we think it's important to highlight these because very much in our view, government policy is downstream from the ideology that is accepted in government. So if, for example, you think a capable state is best, then your policies will flow from that. If you think a free market is better, again, policies will flow from that sort of. So the idea that policies are downstream from ideology, we wanted to see, are we getting those fundamentals right in terms of unlocking, creating the conditions for real economic growth? So first up, we look at energy and energy availability factor for Eskom. We went from 2011 till 2022 to try and make sense of what is happening with Eskom. Of course, one of the growth fundamentals of any economy is reliable electricity. And again, here, whether you think that should be renewable or nuclear or hydro, either way, it should be reliable and relatively cheap. Otherwise, you aren't really going to see economic activity taking off to any significant extent. So the green line, you can see on the left-hand side, energy availability around 84%, but the steady decline, unfortunately, over time to about 59% recently. And these are all numbers that we obtained from Eskom's own status reports. So the basic things around not doing maintenance right, we're not sort of calling for nuclear power stations to be built overnight or anything like that, but just maintaining your fleet and doing the basics right in terms of your coal-fired power stations that you do have, making sure that they work as they should do, would have already helped to ensure this particular situation did not happen. But over time, you can see, unfortunately, that energy availability factor declining. And then in relationship with that, you can see the increase of the unplanned outage factor. So not having the right skills in place, not having the number of engineers in place due to various policies that were implemented before. You can see where the unplanned outage factor was around 6% in 2011, how it has increased to above 28% and will likely continue to increase. It's sort of that snowball effect where government simply can't keep up, Eskom can't keep up with outages and ensuring that it is maintaining its fleet at this point in time. Looking at another growth fundamental, education, very important for any country to get education right. And given the country's history, of course, trying to upskill South Africans, especially Black South Africans, trying to enable them to live a life of agency and maybe have a good job and maybe create a business for themselves. But you need a good level of education for that, of course. So for this particular metric, we looked at the number of pupils from grade 1 who made it through to grade 12 and who wrote university entrance exams, etc., who actually made it through the school system. Because every year in January, we were given the matric pass rate and the number of pupils, and it's touted as a success. But we think it's important to look at how many of the pupils in a cohort were left behind. So if you look at the number of pupils in grade 1 in 2010, just over 1 million. Those who made it then to grade 10 in 2019, you lost just under 100,000. So not too bad in terms of those who made it through to grade 10. A bigger drop, unfortunately, for those who made it through to grade 11. And then grade 12, we've got 750,000 and 704,000 who were NSC candidates who wrote in 2021. So you've already got a decline there from grade 1 to those who made it to grade 12. Those who obtained their NSC passes, just over 500,000. So you've lost about half of your cohort already then. And then those who got their bachelor passes in 2021, a quarter of that. And then finally, those who obtained a math pass mark of 50% or above, just under 60,000. So thinking of South Africa in terms of being connected, the globalized world where you need maths and science and those particular skills, you can argue on this picture that we aren't equipping young South Africans with the right education and the right skills in the first place, but also we're leaving a lot of them behind. And in my view, the unions play a big role in this particular picture because there isn't a sense of accountability and if a school administrator or a teacher doesn't perform, then they are on average not held to account because the unions wield quite a lot of power. So there's no real meritocracy, as it were. And unfortunately, this impacts the most on young Black South Africans. Another growth fundamental for any country, gross fixed capital formation. So things like factories, mines, sinking capital into a country, you need that stuff to create jobs. It's one thing to talk about job creation and job summits, and we want these job targets of however many million jobs created per year, but you don't have any of that if you don't have fixed capital formation happening, if you don't have actual brick and mortar being sunk into a country. So we went from 94 up until 2021, and you can see again the country did relatively well up until 2008, around 22%. But since that time, the steady decline to where we're at 13% in 2021. And to highlight again 2008, that was when the ANC adopted expropriation without compensation as a central plank of its policy offering. And if you tell people that you're going to take their property in different forms, local citizens, foreign investors, people of all sorts, homeowners, etc., if you dilute the concept and the sanctity and security of property rights, then you should not be surprised when that fixed capital formation steadily declines. And without reversing this trend, in our view, we won't see a reversal in terms of the unemployment rate at the moment. So just to sum up, the key risks to economic performance in South Africa, we've got collapsing infrastructure. So again, the roads, crumbling railway, ports, that sort of thing, energy, water, and communication, especially that communication point. I think a lot of us are, of course, unfortunately used to things like load shedding, but if things go really badly, how do you deal with declining communication infrastructure? How do you make sure that your community can still communicate, can still work with each other to try and solve things or not? That's a big risk, I think. You've got the declining capacity of the public administration. So things like licenses, ordinary administrative processes, visas. I think that's a particular pressure point for a lot of South Africans now. Then you've got the local policy environment, where you've got things like localization, this focus on upping local manufacturing capacity, but doing it through, for example, subsidies or through higher tariffs on imports, which again affect South Africans quite negatively, because at the moment we've not decimated, but declined our own manufacturing capacity to such a point that we have to import. If you put high tariffs on those imports, on those materials, on those components, you make it more difficult for South African businesses to operate. And then finally, the property rights point, always at risk, unfortunately, in South Africa. You've got a skills shortage, unemployment, and social instability, particular risks, I think, for businesses and communities to be aware of. How do they deal with the social instability point? And then finally, the global risks. So you've got currency devaluation, market contractions. Countries in Europe and the US are implementing things like carbon taxes. How is that going to impact on South Africa, especially going forward? Next up, we turn to the likelihood of reform. And here we chose a picture of a bridge in Cape Town, which unfortunately was not completed. So there was hope of completion and hope of building, etc. But at some point that steam ran out. So what do we think of the likelihood of substantive reform in South Africa? So here we look at the ANC's National Executive Committee, or NEC, the sort of Politburo or decision-making body of the ANC. Firstly, we looked at ANC, NEC members and corruption and the relationship there. So we looked at things like media reports, Zondo Commission, various different sources to try and come up with this picture that we're going to provide to you now. So if we look at the number of NEC members who implicated in serious corruption, you had 41 of the total. Those who are clearly not implicated, 8, and unknown, 31. So the balance very much in there at the moment. Those implicated in serious corruption, the majority. This doesn't mean that high-level prosecutions are going to happen. And of course, if you were a member of the NEC, the probability that you're going to implement reforms that might then lead to you ending up in jail is relatively lower. So it's sort of self-interest point of view. And then just in terms of ideology, we wanted to look at the balance of opinion in the cabinet as a proportion of the total, those who are pro-fundamental reforms, those who are anti-reforms, and those who are possibly open to reform. So if you look at, firstly, in our view, those who are anti-fundamental reforms, the vast majority, and those who are possibly open to reform, a small minority. And here, when we talk about reforms, we're not talking about things like a spectrum auction or maybe speeding up visa processes, all of which can be nice, but which benefit fewer citizens in the country than they should. We're talking about, when we talk about real reform, we talk about things like labor law reform, we talk about competition in electricity. There was the lifting of the cap for self-generation of 100 megawatts, but you still need to get a license from NERSA, for example, from the National Energy Regulator of South Africa. Is that process going to be sped up or not? Do you need political connections to get that license? In terms of other reforms, things such as competition and private sector investment in the ports and the railways, at the moment, you can bid to obtain a slot on some of the railways, especially towards Richards Bay, but that's only for a period of 2 years, and with a caveat that Transnet remains the custodian of infrastructure. So you, as a private sector player, invest your capital, you sink your billions into upgrading those particular railway sectors, but Transnet can still take that infrastructure at any point. So in our view, not real reforms being offered at the moment. We wanted to look at President Ramaphosa's favorability versus how the ANC has performed in 2021, just to look at how strong he is or not? Does he have a grip on the party or not? And in terms of his own favorability, over 60%, and how the ANC performed in 2021, we had 46%. So in our view, the president is very strong and very popular, both within the party and in South Africa. He's by far the most popular political figure in South Africa, the most well-known. So in our view, he does have the favorability and the popularity, but he is inhibited and stymied, number one, by his governance model, the sort of idea of social compacting and not offending anyone in the party and in the broader tripartite alliance, but also secondly by ideology. He very much believes in the guiding principles of the ANC, of the National Democratic Revolution, which means even if afforded the opportunity for fundamental reform, he in his view needs to ensure that the boat isn't rocked too much, that the party remains united. And you don't want to introduce radical things which will lead to schisms and infighting and that sort of thing. So you need to keep things as stable as possible, listen to everyone around the table, etc., etc. Turning to voter priorities for South Africans, so what is important to them in terms of how they feel about things on the ground. Is this the same as what politicians tell us or not? So we look at the most serious problem in the country, again, from our polling that we did in 2021. We've got various items on this particular list that we put to those who partook in the survey. And if you look at the very top, unemployment or creating jobs around 46%, the abuse of women or children at 42%, and then things like corruption, load shedding, education, water and sanitation, so sort of service delivery issues very high for the majority of South Africans in terms of getting issues solved. So the most serious problem, that doesn't mean the other issues aren't problems, but this means that for most South Africans, these are the biggest ones to try and solve. And at the moment, they don't feel that maybe the necessary solutions are being offered. When you go further down, interestingly, you look at things like land reform, BE, racism, very low in terms of the most serious problem in the country. This isn't to say that these things do not occur, that they're not problems to be solved and should be addressed in the right way. But in terms of should the government be solving this or not, and is the government the best agent to solve it for South Africans, I think the majority feel maybe that's not the most important thing in their lives. It's much more important to get a job, for example, or to be able to take care of one's family, to know that your community is safe, that sort of thing. Turning towards a political shift, are we going to see a political shift in South Africa going forward? In our view, this is a very real possibility and is indeed already happening in certain ways. So now I'm going to try and give you a bit of the political overview at the moment. So for this particular graph, we looked at the broad drift of the opposition versus the broad ANC church. And when we talk about the broad ANC church, we talk about the ANC and the EFF. So ideologically very much aligned, just in terms of the radicalness, in terms of how quickly they want to implement certain policies and ideas. In terms of mapping this, we've got as a basis GDP growth. So we've taken this as our main metric. Again, just to remind you, the two different eras. So before 2008, economic growth doing pretty well, GDP growth, and then after that, steadily declining. And now we're going to track how different political movements have performed against that metric. So if you look at the ANC, just in terms of the solid orange line, as GDP growth increased, the ANC was rewarded at the polling station, where it got around 70%, quite an achievement, even with the goodwill that it had from 94. It was delivering in terms of economic growth and job creation. But since then, as GDP growth has declined, so too has support for the ANC at the polls declined to where they are now hovering between 50 and 40%. If we add EFF support to the ANC vote, you can see it's a little bit better in the last few years than it might have been just on its own. But again, you've got a decline in 2021 and quite a sharp decline. So regardless of ANC or EFF, both doing worse than they did before. And then we take that versus, or on the other hand, you've got the broader opposition, the black line, as economic growth has declined, as GDP growth has declined, support for the opposition parties. The broad opposition has increased, where again, up until 2021, we had a very big increase here in terms of support and votes for opposition parties as an alternative. And then finally, we wanted to project a little bit going forward what might happen. So in our view, economic growth is likely to remain below 2%, maybe even would be likely to get 1.5%, which again means lower economic activity, more frustration with the status quo. And that, in our view, means continued decline in support for the ANC and possibly more support for opposition parties. Just looking at estimates and election outcomes, this particular graph we don't include to try and say whether we can do accurate predicting in terms of election outcomes, but more you'll see here the other category and how that looks in terms of how it shook out in 2021. So here we have our own estimates in terms of how we thought the parties would perform. So we thought the ANC would get just under 50%, the DA 22, the EFF 12, and the other parties would get 17. And then in terms of the actual election outcomes, we had the ANC performing worse than we thought they would. The DA we called exactly right. The EFF, again, also performed less well than we thought they would. But the most interesting thing here to highlight, and which I think a lot of political commentators and analysts have missed, maybe in the South African context, is just how much the other support for other parties has grown from 17 to 22%, where we really we missed that one where we thought they would only get 17%, but where South African voters maybe feel this is where they can affect change by voting for smaller parties in terms of coalitions and that sort of thing. And then finally, we come to the scenario set, the scenario planning, where we're going to try and sketch what could happen in South Africa heading into 2024 and going forward. Again, with this metaphor of the buffalo, the ANC buffalo dominating the South African savannah. So we've got our axes here at the top. We've got ANC electoral support above 50% and then ANC electoral support below 50%. And then on our x-axis, we've got on the right-hand side, effective reform strategy versus no reform strategy. So we're going to look at 4 scenarios and how will these different metrics, how could these metrics impact on those scenarios and how they happen or not. So we've got our 4 scenarios here, and I'm going to break them down now in more detail for you. So the first one, we've got ANC electoral support above 50% and an effective reform strategy, which means the ANC buffalo charges forward. In this particular scenario, you can see sweeping labor, empowerment, energy, education, and property rights reforms, which means that growth rates increase to average 5% by 2029. The debt curve is arrested, it peaks and dips, and the currency strengthens. You've got living standards and jobs resuming on those 1994 to 2007 trend lines, and the ANC is rewarded for that because confidence will rise, and it secures a moderate majority in 2024, and support rises into 2029. Then we look at the wild dogs making the kill. So you've got effective reform strategy and ANC support below 50%. And this is the coalitions model, the coalitions idea. So the wild dogs making the kill. Again, you had the thought of the ANC as the mighty buffalo, and maybe some political commentators thought a lion would emerge to take down that buffalo, or another buffalo to challenge the dominant one. But in our view, maybe a pack of wild dogs is better equipped and better able to take down a buffalo, a big animal, if indeed they manage to not fight with themselves the whole time. So in the scenario, you've got reforms being delayed. The ANC gets a majority still, but below 50% in 2024. And you've got 5 years of unstable coalition. So again, not trying to say that coalitions are will solve everything and things will work very well. It could be very unstable, but in this scenario, that is what happens. Then in 2029, you've got a new political player dominating the coalition, maybe some sort of center-right political figure or party, and then you've got sweeping structural reforms introduced with foreign assistance and foreign requirements for that assistance. And then finally, you've got growth, jobs, and living standards recovering through the 2030s. So on this view, South Africa is on a better path in the 2030s, but before then, it's still going to be quite a bit of pain. And then next up, we look at the hyenas plundering the carcass. So you've got no reform strategy and ANC support below 50%. And in this particular scenario, to just map it out, so you've got reforms failing to materialize, and the ANC majority is below 50% in 2024, which triggers a populist or nationalist coalition. So the ANC wants to remain in power, and it tries to broker a deal with more populist or nationalist other political parties. And that means that you've got expansive expropriation without compensation, you've got asset prescription and nationalization, which means that the debt and deficit blow out, you've got more currency printing, and even more investors and skills flight out of the country, with the final consequence that living standards reverse dramatically and civil rights are impeded. So a very bad scenario for civil society, for example, for NGOs, media, that sort of thing. And then our final scenario, we've got the buffalo stumbling on. So you've got anti-electoral support above 50%, but no effective reform strategy. And in this scenario, we've got fruitless reform rhetoric. So again, talks about reform, but nothing of substance being implemented. You've got economic exclusion, deepening more higher unemployment and people out of the job market. You've got the ANC capitalizing on that exclusion to hold majorities in metros, etc. And you've got the opposition parties floundering and failing to exploit the political environment. So they're struggling to really deal with the opportunity they've been presented. They keep on fighting with each other, backstabbing. Maybe some of the things we've seen in Johannesburg, in the city council, for example. So they fail to exploit that environment. And then South Africa significantly underperforms our emerging market peers into the 2040s. So sort of steady decline scenario. And then just one final time again, the buffalo charging, the wild dogs making the kill, the hyenas plundering the carcass, and the buffalo stumbling on. And I believe that is the end of the presentation. I hope that this has been useful and informative. Thank you to those of you who stuck with me through the technical difficulties. We hope that this provides at least something to think about. With the scenario model and the sort of future planning, it's important to keep in mind that we aren't going to try and sell you on one particular scenario, but the point is to try and prepare adequately for each one. So regardless of which one of the four happens to come true in South Africa, how are you as an individual, your family, your community, your business, your networks, how can you weather and deal with whatever those different scenarios present you? Thank you very much.
Chris, thanks very much for interesting and somewhat depressing scenario in equal measures. I'd like to invite anyone with a question to type it into your live chat, and then I'll post that to the screen for Chris. We've got a few minutes available to do that. I just wonder, Chris, while we're waiting for that, whether it's feasible to have a view from you. Is there a tipping point? Is there some event that is the tipping point? Do you think? Is it the electoral, the next election, or is it the leadership, ANC leadership conference? Is there something that we should all be worried about?
I think the elections, especially, and I say this because the ANC might become more desperate heading into that election. So who is it going to partner with or not? How is it going to want to maintain patronage networks and control? So as the party becomes more desperate heading into 2024, again, as a consequence of its own choices, so load shedding, high unemployment, all those things, for example, caused by the party itself, putting it under more pressure, how is it going to deal with that into 2024? And who is it going to vote for or not? Who is it going to go with or not? I don't think anything radical will happen this year in December at the elective conference. I do foresee President Ramaphosa being re-elected or being elected again as leader of the ANC. I think he's their best selling point. This doesn't rule out, I'm not going to tell you 100%, that there might not be some sort of palace coup or something like that with different factions trying to fight with each other and take over. But fundamentally, I think he will lead the party going forward into 2024. So don't be too concerned about the elective conference happening now. In terms of other risk points, there's always the possibility of new riots. Again, as people are quite desperate in terms of unemployment and less economic activity, it might be exploited by political actors. So, for example, last year you had the narrative around former President Jacob Zuma and his arrest. I think that was a convenient story and a convenient excuse, which made use of the frustration on the ground. So if, for example, you are in KZN, that's a particular province which could flare up again at some point. Urban centers, I think, are always at risk just because of the concentration of people. Maybe if you're in more rural South Africa, you're a bit better off. But even then, you can't then get as much services and goods as you did if you were in the city, for example. So all these things are difficult to navigate and deal with. But if you can make sure that you're somewhat adequately prepared, I think you can come out on the other side with the potential growth that South Africa still affords. And here I talk about a young population, for example. The African continent as a whole has a lot of potential if we get the ideas, that sort of thing right. But are we going to get that right? That's the big question.
Okay, thanks. I see that Roger had a good question. He's also trying to put you on the spot, I think.
So thanks very much, Roger, for the question and for being with us. Which of the four scenarios are the most and least likely? At the moment, the most likely, I would say, is the Buffalo stumbling on. So the ANC being near 50%-ish, going into coalition with some smaller parties maybe, but no effective reform strategy being implemented. And my reason for saying this scenario is most likely, in my view, is because of the coalition parties infighting and not focusing on maybe 3 or 5 priorities heading into 2024 in terms of how they can convince voters to vote for them. Some of the analogy we think about and the psychological reasons behind voting. If you think of the ANC as being many people's psychological and emotional home, given the role that the ANC played in the past 20, 30 years, then you've got the coalition parties building a new hotel across the street. It's very nice. All the lights work. The roof doesn't leak. And now they're trying to convince people to move into that hotel. Psychologically and emotionally, it's still a different building from where you grew up, from your home. So you need to make that emotional connection with voters. How do you convince them to move out of their home into a different building in terms of giving coalition parties their vote? And unfortunately, at this point in time, coalition partners and parties are maybe squandering some of this momentum. And I'm concerned that they aren't going to get it right before 2024. And then just in terms of the least likely scenario, I would say it's on the top right-hand side. So the one of the Buffalo charging on. I don't see radical reforms being implemented anytime soon. I don't think that the patronage networks and the self-interest that unfortunately the ANC has engaged in pretty much across the board up until this point in time, especially the last few years, that's not going to be broken sufficiently quickly enough to reverse the policy direction and to change that quickly enough in terms of implementing effective reform. So in my view, where the ANC manages to reform very well and again see its voting share increase, I think is the least likely to happen.
Yeah. While you were talking, I was thinking about whether the coalition, the smaller parties and the coalitions were getting stronger, or whether the ANC was trying to basically commit suicide by fighting within itself and splitting. And Michael has a more of a comment than a question, perhaps, but I think he's kind of thinking along the same lines.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and here, Michael, I really hope that you've got one or two of the coalition leaders standing up and taking that lead in terms of being afforded this opportunity. I mean, to think that the ANC can drop below 50% would have been unimaginable even 10 years ago, 5 years ago. So now this opportunity is being presented, and it can happen. And then maybe afterwards the coalition partners can worry about some of the other issues in terms of sorting it out between themselves. But you've got to take this opportunity now while you still can. And indeed, as the ANC becomes more desperate, you're going to see it trying to undermine coalitions in certain ways. Maybe there's going to be money exchanging hands in certain backhanded, under the table ways. So don't discount that risk happening. As I think with any political party, if it has dominated and if it sees itself as the rightful ruler of the country, if it becomes more pressed into a corner, what is it going to resort to? And don't underestimate what it might resort to. Don't be sort of shocked, as President Ramaphosa might ostensibly be.
Is there time for one more question, Chris, before we leave?
Yes, please.
Just one more, then the last one from Richard.
Thank you, Richard. Is there a danger of the EFF as kingmakers being coalition? Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I think, Richard, you highlight a very important point. I've changed. Yeah, I think my thinking at the moment with the EFF has crystallized a bit where I don't know if they'll go into coalition with the ANC, because I don't see Julius Malema hitching his in his view rising star with the fading star, or hitching his wagon, should I say, to the fading star that is the ANC. So why would he want to risk his own political future for the ANC? That's what I hope. Maybe I'm fooling myself in this view. But on the other hand, what better way to get him into the ANC and to get the votes from the EFF for the ANC than promising him the vice presidency, for example, or other very high positions in cabinet to his lieutenants and that sort of thing. And if you bring in a force like the EFF and someone with this sort of political nous and rhetorical skill that Julius Malema has, and if you've got, on the other hand, an organization like the ANC, which is stuck in its ways, which doesn't have momentum, if you bring in that new force, it might very well be the one thing that the ANC needs to push it really on a policy path with more radical policies. So upping things like BEE, implementing expropriation without compensation, nationalizing pension funds, national health insurance, so nationalizing effectively all healthcare in the country. You could very well see that breath of the EFF, the new breath, pushing the ANC along a more radical path, because the ANC, I don't think at this point in time, believes in its own sort of vision anymore. So if you've got another force coming in, it could very much push the party in that direction.
Okay, well, thank you, Chris. That's most illuminating. I think we'll be watching some of the moves in the future a little bit more intelligently now from what you've told us and what you've shown us. And certainly the stats and the trends don't bode very well. But let's hope that someone else. I hope, just as a side, do you share this with people in government? These kind of trends and stats? Okay, so they do know.
Yes, they do. We do have a few government departments in terms of regular engagement, that sort of thing, embassies, etc., etc. But I think, again, it's that self-interest point. So maybe they think if they just try a little bit harder with some of their policies, maybe then things will reverse. They don't see that the policies themselves cause the problem. So maybe it's just getting a different head of department in or something like that. So at the moment, it's a case of trying to convince them of that. And some of them, I mean, yeah, this isn't a very popular view with some of my colleagues, but I do think there are good people in various departments who are trying to do the right thing in terms of service delivery, etc., etc. So you need to give them this information, this data, so that they can also use it in their day-to-day work. And we try and give that across the board, also to political parties. If anyone watching would like some of the sources and the data, we're very happy to share that as well, and engage with you in terms of interrogating. Maybe you can also help us see things that we aren't seeing at the moment. It's both depressing and exciting trying to do sort of scenario planning and data analysis, and the more eyes on it, maybe the better.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, Chris, thank you very much again. And we really appreciate your time this afternoon. And on behalf of all the members of U3A Helderberg, thanks very much. Given us a lot of things to think about and potentially worry about, but at least that'll give us something to think about while we have our glass of wine this evening, or second glass of wine this evening, probably. I'm going to end the broadcast right now. So again, Chris, thanks very much. Take care. See you.